Welcome to Serafina Audiobook Collections.
Chapter 1: The Failing Hearth Broken Heart. The air in the Alpha den was thick and stale, heavy with the smell of old parchment and the faint, coppery scent of sickness Rylan couldn't scrub away. It was a smell that whispered of failure. Rylan gripped the edge of his mahogany table, knuckles white, staring down at the handwritten ledgers. They were arranged like tombstone slabs. Truth be told, the numbers were a death sentence. The last 3 birth cycles showed a shocking 70% rate of severe genetic defects. Maybe it was fate, but Rylan knew it was just generations of isolation. We are breeding ourselves into extinction, he thought, the truth biting harder than any winter wind. He ran a weary hand over his jaw. Deep down, he knew the truth. His traditional solutions, his revered lineage, were failing because the pack's blood had become too thin, too bitter. He needed a cure that existed outside the ancient texts, but to suggest it openly was political suicide. A sharp rap on the heavy door snapped him out of his grim arithmetic. "Alpha, I trust I'm not disturbing your rest?" Rylan recognized the voice immediately. Elder Torvin. A scent of dried sage and barely concealed condescension preceded him. "Come in, Elder," Rylan commanded, sweeping the incriminating ledger pages into a locked box with practiced speed. Instead of looking at Torvin, Rylan busied himself stirring the weak, bitter herbal tea he used to mask the stress. Torvin entered, his spine ramrod straight, his face a roadmap of disapproval. He was the chief keeper of tradition, the living embodiment of the pack's isolationist rot. "I came to discuss the matter of the Western patrols. They are weak, Alpha. Undermanned." "I am aware," Rylan replied, using a deceptively calm tone. On the other hand, he knew Torvin wasn't there for perimeter reports. "We need strong leadership on all fronts, Alpha." "And strong Luna energy," Torvin stressed the final words, his gaze sharp and accusatory. He paused, letting the silence accuse Rylan of his bachelor status. Which meant the attack wasn't about the patrols at all. It's been too long since the last Alpha pair ruled the Stenver. The pack grows restless, Rylan. What's worse, the spirits feel unbalanced, they thirst for a clear path forward. "He thirsts for my seat," Rylan thought, watching the elder carefully. "The spirits of the great wolf will be satisfied when the health of the pack is secured," Rylan retorted, meeting the challenge directly. In fact, he felt a flash of cold fury because Torvin always played politics while children died in their cribs. "Do you ever think about anything but power?" Rylan wondered. Torvin's eyes narrowed, but he merely inclined his head. "I have arranged a ceremony for tomorrow, to call for guidance from the ancestors. As a result, perhaps they will show you the path to a Luna, Alpha. Or perhaps, a replacement." The threat hung in the air, heavy and blunt. Without another word, Torvin turned and left, his departure more damning than his presence. Rylan stood alone, the weight of the den, of the pack's failing blood, pressing down on him like an unseen mountain. He had to act. But how? Just like that, everything changed. Through the narrow, dusty window of the den, Rylan saw a flash of movement. It was Maya. She was dragging a heavy deer carcass toward the rendering sheds, a gruesome task usually assigned to the lowest ranking. Her thin tunic was torn, her cheek was smeared with mud and dried blood, but her stance was unbreakable. Her human body, typically the symbol of their fear and shame, moved with an almost jarring, untainted resilience. She wasn't one of them, she was pure outside blood, pure outside perspective. A flash of foreign brilliance in the gray, dying pack. That's why Rylan froze. He had found his solution, ugly as it was. The only viable move left. The scent of her fear and the raw, earthy smell of the kill combined, and Rylan realized, if she was truly worthless, why did his chest ache watching her struggle alone? Soon after, he began making plans to assess the external risk, the final piece of justification he needed to use the human as his bridge to a future. Chapter 2: The Outside Threat Wolf Face. The air outside the settlement was clean, crisp, and deceptively cold. Rylan moved with a hunter's silent grace near the wall, the ancient, ivy-covered stone perimeter that symbolized the pack's strict isolation. Meanwhile, the elders preached that the wall was inviolable, their protection absolute. Rylan knew it was a psychological shield, not a physical one. He was in his large, scarred wolf form, his coat a deep, smoky gray, almost black, running a silent perimeter check alone. Because of that extreme isolation, his senses were amplified, yet even his supernatural nose was overwhelmed by the sudden, sickeningly sweet smell of human chemicals and processed foods. He found it 50 yards past the northern bend, a hidden clearing. Not only that, but there was indisputable evidence of recent human encroachment. He sniffed a discarded piece of shiny, colored plastic, a modern trash wrapper that smelled faintly of cinnamon and sugar. It was completely foreign to their traditional world, yet it was here. They are close. Rylan scanned the treeline. Even so, the greatest shock came when his paw kicked up a patch of loose soil beneath a thick oak. Beneath lay a small, black object, a trail camera. Its lens stared blankly up at him, a mechanical eye documenting his pack's existence. A shudder, cold and primal, raced through him. Which meant their sacred isolation was a myth, a bedtime story the elders clung to while the human world crept closer like a slow, crushing tide. She didn't know what scared her more, the weakness of his pack or the silent, calculated threat of the world Maya came from. Rylan shifted back, the painful, intense transformation process, the tearing of skin, the cracking of bone, now dull and familiar. He picked up the camera. That's why he needed Maya's perspective. He needed to understand the silent, technological threat that wolves could not smell, fight, or outrun. He crushed the camera in his hand, the small snap of plastic echoing the fragility of their ancient lives. But then, he heard the distant sound of the ceremonial drums begin to beat, signaling the start of the funeral rites. A wolf has died. Another life lost to thin blood. Rylan needed to return. After that, he would finalize the desperate calculus, using a human to fight the threat of humanity, and using a lie to fight the rot of tradition. With every step he took back toward the settlement, the urgency mounted, pulling him toward the inevitable, explosive confrontation that would either save his pack or tear it apart forever. Chapter 3: The Desperate Gaze Candle. The funeral pyre cast long, dancing shadows across the main ceremonial ground, making the faces of the pack look spectral and hungry. The air was heavy with the solemn scent of burning juniper and the acrid smoke of the fire, a poor cover for the underlying tension. Rylan took his place on the alpha's stone seat, the cold granite a stark contrast to the boiling anger inside him. Elder Torvin stood opposite, leading the rites. He was wearing his traditional white ceremonial furs, which made him look like a vengeful god carved from snow. Torvin spoke of the deceased wolf's purity, his sacrifice, and the need for the pack to weed out the weakness before the ancestors would grant them new life. Rylan watched him, every word a subtle attack. Not only that, but Torvin's eyes kept flicking to the edges of the crowd, commanding compliance. Rylan scanned the crowd. Between them, something cracked, the fragile peace Rylan had maintained through sheer force of will. He quickly spotted Maya. She was standing at the very periphery, near the boundary markers, a solitary shadow in her patched, dull clothing. Her grief was quiet, private. She was mourning her mother's protector, but also the relentless rejection she faced. A mid-ranking wolf named Tiber stepped forward. Tiber was a popular figure, easily swayed, and clearly chosen by the elders for this moment. His voice was thick with emotion. "Alpha!" Tiber shouted, dropping to one knee dramatically. "The whispers are loud. The sickness is here because we harbor impurity. The great wolf demands a cleansing. We must offer a human sacrifice to balance the scales." Silence fell, thick as falling snow. The words hung there, ugly, ancient, and undeniably effective. Tiber looked directly at Maya. "We must sacrifice Maya," he screamed, pointing. "She is the burden who carries the human taint. She is the last reminder of the secret our isolation protects. Give the spirits what they demand." Rylan's blood ran cold. Now. Before she could move, before the elders could sanction it, the political necessity became a sudden, violent, protective urge. "She may be my tool, but she will not be their victim." Rylan pushed himself up from the alpha seat. The scraped stone groaned beneath his weight. In that moment, Rylan shed the weary politician. He was just the alpha fighting for the survival of the last viable option. He ignored Torvin's small, triumphant smile, the snare already sprung. Rylan focused entirely on Maya, whose eyes were wide, dark pools of fatalistic terror. She felt it, clear as day, the shift in the crowd, the finality of the demand. But as Rylan moved, his alpha scent, dark, cold, and commanding, hit her, and Maya tilted her head slightly, confused. "What is he doing?" As if summoned, Rylan walked toward the center fire, his black leather boots crunching on the dried earth. He positioned himself perfectly, standing between the pack and Maya. The silence was deafening, the fire the only sound. Rylan had to commit now, with a lie so bold it would paralyze his enemies. Which meant he had to say the unspeakable. Chapter 4: The Fated Lie Collision. The pack was silent, the fire crackling as if mocking the tension. Rylan stood between the frenzy of the traditionalists and the terrified stillness of the human woman who was his last chance. "Sacrifice her, Alpha." Tiber's voice wavered with renewed hope, as if summoned by the silence. "Expel the human taint." Rylan let a low, rumbling growl rise in his chest, a sound more feral than political. It silenced Tiber instantly, which meant Rylan still held the primal authority. He stared directly at Elder Torvin, whose face was a study in cunning, waiting for Rylan to choose the traditional, brutal path. "I will hate myself for this," Rylan thought, the admission sharp and cold. "But the pack will live." Deep down, he knew the truth, his power was the only thing standing between Maya and the pyre. He strode to Maya, stopping directly in front of her. His movement was abrupt, as if pulled by a string. He gripped her arm just above the elbow, a harsh, proprietary hold, and pulled her roughly to her feet. Maya gasped, confusion replacing terror. Her body went stiff, resisting his touch instinctively. Rylan looked out at his pack, his expression a mask of cold, unbreakable authority. The moment their eyes locked, he felt a tiny spark of something, but he shoved it down. "Maya is no sacrifice," he declared, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "She is my Luna. She is my fated mate." The sound that followed was not a roar, but a devastating, collective gasp. It was the sound of sacred law shattering. Elder Torvin's face contorted, going white with a rage so profound it was almost beautiful. "Impossible! She is human! It is a lie!" Torvin shrieked, breaking tradition by openly challenging his alpha. "It is the fate's decree. Rylan countered instantly, his voice a hammer blow. He leaned closer to Maya, his voice a low, fierce snarl meant for her ears only. Play your part, human. Or they will still have your throat. He lifted his voice again, projecting over the chaotic muttering. Her strength is her untainted human bloodline. She is the bridge we need. The perspective we have lost to centuries of fear. Because of that, Rylan knew he was creating a schism so deep it would lead to war, but it was a controlled war. I can survive the politics of a mate. I cannot survive the politics of a sacrifice. The Luna is chosen by the fates, not your withered traditions. Rylan roared, pointing at Torvin. Challenge me, Elder, and you challenge the will of the great wolf himself. He won the immediate battle by turning the question of sacrifice into a question of rank in mate law. Without thinking, Rylan shoved the stunned woman forward and began to drag her away from the funeral ground, toward the den. What followed was the sound of furious, panicked growls and whispers as the pack scattered, unsure whether to chase their supposed Luna or obey their challenged alpha. Maya stumbled, a passive, terrified victim violently thrust into her new role. The fight had begun. Chapter 5: The Prisoner and the Politician Classical Building. Rylan slammed the heavy oak door of his private chamber shut, the massive sound echoing the finality of his decision. He threw the deadbolt, the iron mechanism protesting loudly. The space between them burned with the sheer force of the political bomb he had just set off. Maya stood exactly where he had released her, near the cold, stone fireplace. She was shaking, not violently, but in tight, small tremors that spoke of deep, buried shock. Her voice trembled as she finally spoke, her tone barely a whisper. What? What was that? Why did you say that? Rylan walked to his writing desk and poured himself a dark amber liquid, a human drink, strong whiskey, for the immediate nerves. He didn't offer her any. That's why he felt a sharp pang of self-loathing, because even in saving her life, he couldn't treat her as anything but a tool. He turned to her. It was a life debt, Maya. I paid for it. A life debt? She repeated, her voice rising slightly. You just ruined my life. They wanted to kill me, and now they want to kill me and you. What am I supposed to do? You are supposed to survive, Rylan stated clinically, taking a hard swallow of the liquor. Which meant he needed to bypass her emotions and appeal to her practicality. Your life on the periphery was a risk. Your mother's secret died with her, but the Elder's fear of you didn't. They were going to sacrifice you to stop the inbreeding panic. What's worse, they were going to use your death to leverage Torvin into my seat. He walked toward her, forcing her to look up. You will play Luna. You will follow my command, and you will not contradict the decree. And if I refuse, she challenged, a flicker of that human resilience he'd spotted earlier showing through her fear. Rylan met her gaze, his expression ice-cold. Then I will hand you to Torvin. And I will tell them the lie was mine alone, but your death is acceptable collateral. He didn't blink. Clinical. Focused. Control the situation. In the span of a breath, the transactional, brutal nature of their bond was established. He was the burdened, pragmatic leader, and she was his forced partner in treason. Because of that, he knew her fear was the only thing he could rely on. He pointed toward an inner door. There is a bath. You will clean yourself. You have your first public duty tomorrow, you will be presented to the pack as my chosen Luna. Soon after, he saw her shoulders slump, the fight leaving her. She turned toward the door, silent obedience her only defense. Rylan watched her leave. Still, the image of her face, betrayed, terrified, yet strangely composed, burned into his mind. He had saved the pack's chance at evolution, but then he realized the true price. He had just condemned the woman he needed to a gilded cage of terror. Chapter 6: The Coal-Packed Wolf Face Handshake. Rylan did not stay in the den for long. After that shattering confrontation with Maya, he needed to secure his political flanks. He moved swiftly to the hidden armory beneath the West Wing, a location unknown to Elder Torvin. He found his two most trusted, reform-minded wolves waiting: Anya, a young warrior with a keen mind for strategy, and Barrick, a former pack sentinel loyal only to the idea of the pack's survival. Barrick's face was grim. "Alpha, the hall is chaos. The elders are convening in the South Wing. They are citing 7 different breaches of law, all centered on the human." "I expected no less," Rylan said, his voice low and firm. He paced the small stone room, the metallic scent of stored blades filling the air. "I need you both to understand the gravity of my declaration." As the silence stretched, "I did not claim a mate out of passion. I claimed her as a strategic necessity, because she is the only remaining untainted link to the outside world, and her genetics are the only pure thing left to save our line." Anya, ever the pragmatist, nodded. "She is the opposite of weakness." "I understand the logic, Alpha. But the pack will never accept it." "They will if they live long enough," Rylan countered. "I risked treason by telling the fated mate lie." Rylan confessed the dangerous truth to them, sealing their loyalty with a shared secret. "Torvin will challenge the fates, he will demand a ritual proof." "And you cannot provide one," Barrick stated simply. "No. Therefore, we will not fight on the field of tradition. We fight on the field of survival." Rylan walked to a large map pinned to the wall. He pointed to the recent human encroachment spots he'd scouted. "The human world is closer than they believe. Torvin's isolation is a death wish. Maya's knowledge is now our greatest asset." He gave them their assignments. Not only that, but they were tasked with guarding the den's immediate perimeter and planting information to distract the Elder's spies. "You will spread the rumor that Maya is already pregnant. It will tie the fates' hands and buy us time. The next 3 days are a siege. Protect Maya. She is the prize Torvin wants." Anya stepped forward, placing her hand over Rylan's heart, a gesture of loyalty. "We are committed to the path of evolution, Alpha." Rylan felt a surge of grim relief. He had his allies. He had his plan. But then, he remembered the terrified woman currently imprisoned in his quarters, forced into a battle she never asked for. Rylan looked at his allies. Meanwhile, he knew the elders were already plotting his downfall. He turned toward the door, adjusting the weight of his resolve. Come morning, the pack would see their new Luna, and the civil war would begin. Chapter 7: The Scrutiny of the Hall. Magnifying glass tilted right. Come morning, the great hall was a cage packed with silent predators. The air didn't just hold the smells of cooked venison and fire, it held the pungent, charged scent of suspicion and simmering rage. Rylan led Maya from his private chambers. He moved with the slow, deliberate confidence of an alpha daring anyone to look at him wrong. As her pulse raced beside him, he could feel Maya's internal turmoil, sharp and immediate even through the minimal clothes she wore, a simple, rough-spun dress he had his servant provide. She looked small, utterly human, and desperately out of place against the massive timber beams and the snarling wolf carvings of the hall. But then, Rylan saw the way her chin was tilted, forcing her gaze to meet the hundreds of eyes focused on her. She hadn't crumpled. He positioned her at his side at the high table, a place reserved only for the Luna. That's why he felt a cold satisfaction. The placement was an immediate, non-negotiable decree. Rylan surveyed the room, his eyes sharp. Elder Torvin sat far across the hall, surrounded by his loyal faction. Torvin did not look at Rylan, he looked only at Maya. His expression was a smooth, chilling mask of disbelief and disgust. Not only that, but Torvin employed his first passive tactic. When Rylan began the ceremonial morning blessing, the Elders' faction pointedly did not offer the traditional bow to Maya. They bowed only to Rylan. It was a subtle, silent mutiny, 1,000 small acts of disrespect challenging Rylan's power. Rylan felt the heat rise in his neck. He is trying to break her spirit, he realized. He is trying to prove I chose weakness. Which meant Rylan had to assert her status without breaking his carefully maintained calm. He reached out, his hand large and heavy, and placed it firmly on the small of Maya's back. He gave a brief, subtle squeeze, a warning, a claim, and a demand for her to hold steady. In the echo of his voice as he finished the blessing, Rylan turned his body toward Maya, isolating their interaction from the hostile room. He leaned down, close enough for the pack to see the intimacy, but quiet enough to maintain their privacy. "Eat," he murmured, his voice low. Maya, pale and shaken, whispered back, "I can't. They're looking at me. They want me dead." "Good," Rylan replied, his eyes never leaving Torvin's faction. "Let them look. You are the Alpha Luna now, because you are the new truth, and fear is the fastest way to accept change." He forced a small, deliberate piece of bread into her hand. He watched her. She lifted it, took a shaky bite, and chewed slowly. The act was minuscule, but defiant. With a single glance across the room, Rylan caught Torvin's gaze and gave the elder a cold, thin smile, the smile of a leader who had just won the first, small skirmish. Still, as Rylan watched her, he noticed her gaze sweeping the hall, not in fear, but with a strange, analytical curiosity. She didn't know what scared her more, the wolves, or the confinement. She is observing me, too, Rylan realized. He would need to turn that scrutiny into cooperation. After that tense breakfast, Rylan knew he had to get Maya on his side, not just through fear, but through the truth of their shared peril. Chapter 8, The Whispered Truth. Shushing face. The den was quiet, the heavy door secured. Rylan was weary of the alpha performance. He dropped into a chair, rubbing his temples. That's why he let the silence stretch for a moment. He needed to see if Maya would break first. Maya was standing by the bookshelf, running her fingers over the leather spines of the ancient, wolf-written lore. She looked less like a frightened hostage and more like a curious scholar. Rylan needed to shift the dynamic. He felt it, clear as day, the difficulty of transitioning from forced captor to desperate educator. "We need to talk about pack law," Rylan began, his tone weary. "And our mate bond. The one that doesn't exist?" Maya asked, her voice dry, without fear, only resignation. Rylan admired her directness. Which meant he could risk the truth. "Yes. The one that doesn't exist," Rylan confirmed. He rose and walked to a hidden compartment in the wall. He pulled out the ledger, the one filled with the sickening statistics of stillbirths and defects. What followed was the sight of the ugly, indisputable truth. He pushed the book toward her. "Look at this, Maya. This is why you are here." She hesitated, then picked up the ledger. She wasn't just skimming, she was reading the grim medical details. "This is genetic. Inbreeding." "Precisely," Rylan confirmed. He explained the pack's ancient fear of human disease, which had led to centuries of severe isolation, because they believed human contact meant contamination. Their purity has become their poison. The average lifespan is declining. The wolf spirit is weakening. He pointed to her. "You are the untainted variable. The one piece of healthy genetic potential left. The lie of the fated mate stops Torvin from killing you, but then the biological reality is that we need your bloodline to survive." He expected tears, anger, or accusations of using her as a broodmare. Instead, Maya looked up, her expression shrewd. You didn't lie for the spirits, Rylan. You lied for the genetics. You're a scientist pretending to be a fanatic. She placed the book down. But then why are they getting so sick now? If inbreeding has been happening for centuries, why is the decline so sharp only in the last decade? Rylan froze. As the silence stretched, he stared at her. His scholars, his elders, his own deep reflection, none had asked that simple, shrewd question. They were too blind to tradition to see the logic. She sees the facts, not the lore. Just like that, everything changed. The pawn had become an intellectual partner. Rylan had the horrifying truth of his pack's weakness, but Maya, the outsider, had identified the open loop in his data, the sharp decline. With his scent in the air, Rylan leaned in, a flicker of genuine curiosity replacing his alpha facade. I don't know. Why? Soon after, he realized that if she could solve the secondary crisis, their partnership might transcend the lie, and he would have the evidence he needed to defeat Torvin. Chapter 9: The Refusal of Rank Prohibited. The ceremony was a simple, quarterly affair, the recognition of rank, where the Alpha acknowledged the status of various hunters and healers. Today, it was a trap. Rylan led Maya into the hall, feeling the weight of the new information, his desperate need for her insight into the sharp decline, and his need to shield her from the political fallout of the lie. As if fate demanded it, he tightened his grip on her hand, a public declaration that was becoming a genuine anchor for his sanity. The climax arrived when Elder Torvin's apprentice, a mid-level healer named Varric, approached the high table to receive his rank affirmation. Varric bowed low to Rylan, a perfect, respectful gesture. But then, when he was required to repeat the gesture to Luna, Varric stood stiffly upright, his jaw tight. He simply averted his eyes from Maya. Torvin's smirk was subtle but triumphant. The tension broke with the sound of several gasps from the neutral faction of the pack. It was a direct, calculated refusal to acknowledge Maya's Luna status. Rylan felt the primal fury mixed with absolute control rise. He knew he couldn't let this disrespect stand, because if he allowed Varric to deny her rank, the whole pack would follow suit, and his political platform would crumble. Varric, Rylan's voice was dangerously low, amplified by his alpha power. You acknowledge your alpha, yet you refuse Luna. Explain yourself. Varric, bolstered by Torvin's silent presence, spoke with forced righteousness. Alpha, I honor your rule. But this is a human. She has no scent of the fates and no Luna blood. My spirit will not offer allegiance to a common woman over the pack's sacred law. That's why Rylan knew he had to crush the rebellion instantly and brutally. Without warning, Rylan moved. It wasn't a wolf attack, it was a political maneuver, swift and devastating. He didn't hit Varric. He grabbed the ceremonial rank scroll from Varric's hand and ripped it in half. Your rank is void. Your allegiance is corrupted by the whispers of the past. Rylan's eyes, bright gold with alpha threat, locked onto Varric. You will leave the hall, and you will work in the rendering sheds, serving the human you despise, until the Luna decrees otherwise. The punishment, exile to the lowest rank, directly beneath Maya, was harsh, humiliating, and utterly effective. The silence was absolute. Varric looked to Torvin for help, but Torvin, shocked by the force of Rylan's retribution, could only glare. As the echo faded, Rylan watched Varric stumble out. He felt the cold cost of the victory. He had asserted his power but solidified Torvin's hatred. Rylan looked down at Maya. Her heart skipped. Her terror was replaced by a small, hard flicker of determination he hadn't seen before. She met his eyes, not with gratitude, but with the quiet understanding that they were co-conspirators now. She is learning the rules of the game. From there, Rylan realized he wasn't just defending a pawn, he was forging a weapon. Their shared survival depended on that cold, clear gaze. Chapter 10: The Siege of Silence Ice Cube. Rylan felt the heat of his anger every time he walked past the supply sheds. That's why he knew Torvin was winning the quiet war. The elders couldn't stage a coup yet, so they were waging a battle of inaction. He had tasked 3 separate wolves with gathering the specific nightshade herbs needed for the weakest, sickest pups. But then, when he checked the medical den, the small basket sat empty. The snow was heavy, Alpha. We couldn't find the patch, the healer mumbled, eyes darting away. In fact, Rylan's wolf senses told him the snow was light and the path was clear. It was a lie, a carefully coordinated act of passive sabotage. They are challenging my authority through the suffering of the children. Which meant Torvin was not just trying to replace him, he was actively destroying the pack's survival chances to prove that Rylan's leadership and his human solution were failing. Rylan's temper was frayed, pulled taut like a bowstring. He couldn't physically punish a wolf for failing to find a herb, it would make him look tyrannical. On the other hand, if the pups died, the elders would blame Maya's supposed taint and demand her life. With every heartbeat, the loneliness of his burden grew. He was fighting a shadow war, trying to mend a political wound with a machete while his enemies wielded the finest surgical knives of tradition. Later that afternoon, Rylan sat alone in the den, consumed by a dull, throbbing headache that felt like a pressure cooker behind his eyes. He watched Maya from the corner of his eye. Instead of brooding, she was moving quietly around the massive, cluttered space. A serving wolf had accidentally knocked over a jug of watered soup, deliberately leaving the mess. Yet the wolf hadn't even reached the door before Maya was there, methodically wiping up the spill with a scrap of cloth. She didn't complain. She just acted. Still, Rylan felt the bitter irony. He was the powerful alpha, failing to command basic obedience, while the worthless human was forced to clean up messes born of the very wolves who despised her. As the silence roared between them, he realized how much pressure the silent siege put on her. She cleans the physical wounds because I can't touch the political ones. He stood, his bones aching with weariness. He had to figure out who was leading the sabotage. After that, he needed a solution to the blight that was crippling the communal garden, a resource Torvin's faction claimed was failing because the spirits were rejecting the pack's unmated state. Chapter 11, The Human Insight Light Bulb. Rylan was staring at the latest report on the pack's primary communal garden. The harvest was already dismal, weakened by an aggressive, black blight that looked like oily mold. Because of that, if they lost the garden entirely, the pack would face starvation by the time winter hit, giving Torvin the final proof he needed. It is a spiritual rejection, Rylan muttered, mimicking Torvin's sanctimonious tone. Maya, who had been quietly tending the small fireplace, looked up. She didn't know what scared her more, the wolf blight or the famine. It's not spiritual, she said simply, her voice low and steady. Rylan turned sharply, surprise momentarily overriding his headache. What did you say? The blight. It's not supernatural, or spiritual. Maya walked closer to the map of the garden, her finger tracing the contours of the planting area. Look at the way the mold patterns follow the lower section, where the hill dips. And look at the soil color here. She pointed to the faded map. When I was forced to work near the peripheral marsh last year, I saw something similar. It's not a disease, it's an infection. A fungal infection caused by poor drainage and excessive standing water. Rylan stared at the map, then at her. His mind, trained for centuries in wolf lore and combat tactics, went utterly blank. His elders had insisted the blight was a punishment from the ancestors. Not only that, but his own healers had been trying to cure it with complex, rare herbal antidotes. As the truth unraveled, Rylan realized the profound stupidity of his isolation. He had been fighting a genetic problem with politics, and a fungal infection with spirituality. Drainage, Rylan whispered the human word, tasting the foreign, clinical nature of it. Yes. You need to dig a simple trench along the lower perimeter, diverting the runoff to the river. It's not a cure, it's prevention, Maya explained, her tone purely pragmatic, the voice of the outside world, clinical and clear. Rylan felt a profound, internal shift. Just like that, everything changed. She wasn't a pawn. She wasn't a resource. She was an intellectual lifeline. Her untainted perspective, her strength, had solved a problem his entire pack, bound by ritual and fear, couldn't even name. The moment their eyes locked, his political calculations crumbled. He saw a partner, not a prisoner. That's why a genuine, unforced smile, a rare and startling thing, cracked the Alpha's mask. That is brilliant, Maya. And utterly non-traditional. In that moment, Rylan had confirmation, the risk he took with the lie was not for politics, but for survival. His commitment to her became profoundly real. Chapter 12, Retribution and Escalation Crossed Swords. The next day, Rylan leveraged Maya's solution immediately. He put a team of trusted loyalists, led by Barrick, to work digging the drainage trenches. As a result, within hours, the stench of stagnant water subsided, and the pack watched, confused, as the spiritual blight simply began to dry up. Rylan called an impromptu gathering. He stood beside Maya, keeping his hand protectively on her shoulder, a new, casual intimacy that challenged the elders. "The plague on our garden is halted," Rylan announced, his voice booming across the courtyard. "Thanks to the foresight of Luna. She identified the fault in our physical world, a fault overlooked by those too blind to look outside the sacred texts." He watched the fury boil beneath the surface of Elder Torvin's usually placid expression. Which meant Torvin had to act now, or lose all credibility. Instead of retreating, Torvin took the offense. He stepped forward, his body rigid with barely contained rage. "Alpha, your actions are reckless. You parade this human, and not only that, but you credit her with knowledge that shames our ancestors." Torvin's voice was venomous. "The pack is fractured. The fates demand verification. I publicly demand a ritual challenge or a sacred inquiry into the legitimacy of this fated mate bond." The air crackled. This was the open declaration of war Rylan had been waiting for. A ritual challenge was lethal, an inquiry was a political dissection that would expose his lie. But then, Rylan remembered Maya's clear, analytical gaze. He met Torvin's challenge with cold resolve. "So be it, Elder. We will deal with your challenge soon enough. But until then, you will speak to my Luna with the deference her rank demands." Even so, the stakes were now astronomical. Torvin had escalated the conflict from passive sabotage to an open threat of deposition. Rylan turned to Maya, who stood tall, unwavering, despite the open hostility. He felt it, clear as day, the strong, sharp connection that had been forged not by romance, but by shared treason and strategic necessity. With his scent in the air, Rylan leaned down and murmured into her ear, loud enough for nearby wolves to perceive the intimacy. "We need to talk about their counter-strategy. And we need to meet where their whispers cannot reach us." From there, their partnership, born of a lie and cemented by insight, moved into the shadows. Chapter 13, The Shadowed Vow Crescent Moon. The air in the abandoned watchtower reeked of dust, forgotten snowmelt, and the desperate necessity of secrecy. This was the one place the elders' eyes, or their sensitive, listening wolf ears, could not reach. Rylan stood near the crumbling window, watching the moonlight pool on the wooden floor. He could hear Maya's breath, steady and shallow, behind him. Despite that successful drainage solution, Torvin's ritual challenge was inevitable. Rylan knew that before they could face the elders, he had to face Maya with the unvarnished truth. "Why here?" Maya asked, her voice echoing slightly in the small, closed space. "Because if what I tell you reaches Torvin's ears, we are both dead," Rylan replied, turning to face her. After that simple statement, the tension thickened, heavy and suffocating. Rylan walked toward the table, tracing the deep scratch marks of long-ago guards. His voice trembled slightly, a barely audible vibration that betrayed the magnitude of what he was about to risk. Maya, Rylan began, his eyes locking onto hers. When I stood at the pyre, and I called you my Luna, my fated mate, it was a lie. He let the silence hold the weight of the confession. As the silence stretched, he watched her closely, expecting the fury, the shock, the righteous indignation he deserved. Maya didn't flinch. Her world tilted, but she kept her composure. I knew it was a political maneuver. You needed a shield. The fated mate law is absolute, it protected me from being sacrificed. I figured that out when you showed me the inbreeding records. You knew, Rylan whispered, stunned by her composure. That's why his respect for her spiked again. She saw the angles where I saw only desperation. I knew the political lie, Maya corrected him, her voice suddenly sharp with cold clarity. I didn't know the personal intention. You saved my life. Why? Was it just to use my body for your genetics? This was the question he dreaded. In that moment, Rylan realized his fear wasn't about the pack's survival anymore, it was about losing the connection they had forged through intellectual trust. No, not just that, Rylan admitted, his voice raw. He stepped closer, reaching out but stopping short of touching her. I chose you because you were the only one who saw the blight was drainage, not spirits. I needed your clear eyes. But when I saw them demanding your blood, the lie became about saving the only future I had left. Because of that terrifying, chaotic night, Rylan chose honesty. I will not ask you to bear children for me, Maya, unless you choose it. But I need you to choose to be my partner. From there, we fight this war together, knowing the political penalty for this lie is treason for both of us. Without another word, he extended his hand, not the commanding alpha hand, but a seeking, vulnerable one. He wasn't demanding obedience, he was asking for allegiance. The moment their eyes locked, Maya's terror finally gave way to a powerful, quiet resolve. She placed her small, warm hand in his, sealing their alliance with a vow far stronger than any fated mate bond. As if fate demanded it, Maya asked the crucial question, her voice soft but strong, "What is your plan now, Rylan? Your true intention?" Chapter 14, The Scapegoat's Price Drop of Blood. The air in the great hall, 2 days later, was brittle, anticipating violence. Rylan and Maya walked in together. Not only that, but Rylan maintained their new, easy intimacy, his arm lightly around her shoulder, projecting ownership and partnership. But then, Rylan noticed the tension wasn't just in the elder's corner. It was centered on a young wolf named Kale, the same volatile wolf who had initially called for Maya's sacrifice. Kale was gripping a serving knife tightly. Torvin is making his move. The tension broke with brutal speed. As Rylan and Maya passed the central hearth, Kale lunged, shouting, "The spirits demand vengeance for the treason." He didn't aim for Rylan, he lunged directly for Maya's throat. Rylan moved on instinct, a blur of fur and fury before he could fully shift. He slammed his body into Kale's, sending the younger wolf sprawling. The knife clattered harmlessly away. As the bond pulsed between Rylan and Maya, Rylan protected her without thinking about rank or law. Rylan stood over Kale, his form half-shifted, his muscles bulged, his teeth elongated, and a guttural growl ripped from his chest. This was a primal fury that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with protection. "You dare attack Luna, the Alpha's mate?" Rylan roared. Kale scrambled back, terrified but defiant. "She is a liar. A blight." Torvin said the spirits demand. Rylan cut him off with a vicious, controlled snarl. "Torvin's lies will not cost this pack its future." He grabbed Kale by the scruff of his neck, his alpha power overwhelming the younger wolf. What followed was the terrifying sight of the alpha's wrath, controlled, precise, and lethal in its intent. Because of that calculated attack, Rylan had to make an immediate example. He slammed Kale against the wall, and just like that, everything changed. The political fight had become a physical, pack-wide skirmish. "You will be stripped of your name and your rank," Rylan decreed, his voice vibrating with barely contained violence. "You tried to shed the blood of Luna. You are exiled to the lowest periphery for a year. You will survive by your wits, and only then will the pack consider your return." He hurled Kale away. The younger wolf scrambled up and fled. Still, Rylan's eyes, bright gold with adrenaline, didn't leave the spot where Kale had stood. Yet, as he looked, he noticed something crucial: a small, dark wooden carving lying where Kale had fallen, a rare, distinctive carving of a raven, known to be a private gift given only by Elder Torvin. Proof. Torvin hadn't just influenced Kale, he had orchestrated the attempted murder. Rylan scooped up the carving quickly, hiding it in his pocket. He turned to Maya, placing his hands on her shoulders. She was trembling again, but she looked up at him, her eyes wide with shock, gratitude, and a new, terrible understanding of their enemy. The space between them burned with the cost of that defense. Chapter 15, Treason is Set Scroll. That night, in the safety of the watchtower, the scent of fresh pine and cold stone masked the urgency of their meeting. Rylan laid the small raven carving on the table. Torvin is not fighting a political debate anymore. He is fighting a war of assassination, Rylan stated grimly, sharing the evidence with Maya and his two loyalists, Anya and Barrick. The raven carving is his signature. This proves he commanded Kale to attack Luna, Anya confirmed, her voice tight with fury. That's why Rylan knew he could wait no longer. We launched the preemptive political strike. We charged Torvin with treason. Rylan's goal was now singular: use the evidence of the attempted murder to depose Torvin before the Elder could use the external threat, the approaching humans, as proof that Rylan's human solution was a disaster. Because of that intense external pressure, Torvin was also preparing his final move. Rylan knew the Elders were already gathering evidence from the pack's periphery, using the threat of human encroachment to bolster their claim that Rylan had brought danger, not salvation. Rylan outlined his plan: Barrick would present the carving and the charge of attempted murder to the gathered loyalists. Rylan would then leverage the chaos to demand an immediate vote of no confidence against the Elder. Meanwhile, Rylan looked at Maya. This is the moment of truth. If the attack on Kale fails, the pack will side with the Elders, and we will be exiled, or worse. With every heartbeat, Rylan felt the cold dread of failure, but also the resolute certainty of having Maya by his side. Their bond was forged in shared danger, and it was unbreakable. As the sky darkened outside the window, a frantic pounding erupted on the watchtower door. It was one of Rylan's peripheral scouts, breathless and covered in mud. "Alpha! The wall! It's been breached! Not by animals, not by our own. The external threat has materialized." Rylan's political clock had just violently run out. That night, the war had officially moved from the hall to the territory edge. Chapter 16, Disaster at the Wall Brick. The air along the wall was a chaotic, sickening blend of burnt earth, wolf adrenaline, and the sharp, metallic smell of human technology, specifically, gunpowder. Rylan arrived at the breach point with Maya and his loyalists, his heart pounding a frantic, primal rhythm. The ancient stone perimeter was already compromised. Not a massive break, but a carefully targeted, devastating hole where a small team of human mercenaries had used explosives. That night, the isolationist beliefs of the Elders had cost them dearly. Rylan roared his commands, shifting instantly into his immense, smoky gray wolf form. As her wolf stirred, Maya stood behind the last line of defense, her human eyes wide, taking in the scene with terrifying clarity. But then, Rylan realized the pack's defense was fatally undermined. He had tasked the southern defense section with securing the high ground with a rotating unit of wolves for covering fire. Instead, he found only two terrified, under-equipped teenagers. Torvin's loyalists, commanded by the disgraced Varric, the wolf Rylan had sentenced to the rendering sheds, had pulled the stronger, more experienced fighters away, citing a traditionalist patrol in the deep woods. Sabotage. Because of that, Rylan's carefully prepared defense plan was gutted. He plunged into the fight, a powerful, deadly force. Rylan tore through the mercenary team, the snap of his jaw and the crushing power of his muscles dominating the human attackers. Without thinking, he protected his core fighters, ignoring his own flank. What followed was a brutal, uneven fight. They minimized casualties, but then a mercenary, hidden by the dust and chaos, fired a projectile meant not to kill, but to cripple. The syringe dart, filled with a potent wolf sedative, slammed into Rylan's shoulder. The effect was instantaneous and shocking. Rylan's legs crumpled. His massive wolf body seized, and the world dissolved into a blinding wave of agonizing heat and profound weakness. He shifted back instantly, desperately fighting the chemicals, landing hard on the rough stone. With every heartbeat, the power drained from him. He was wounded and compromised. To make things worse, in the chaotic retreat, Rylan saw a dark shape near his fallen body, Elder Torvin, briefly visible through the smoke. Torvin was not fighting the mercenaries. He was simply watching Rylan fall. And then he vanished. Rylan had failed. The pack was breached, his fighters were retreating, and he had confirmation that his own council was more interested in his deposition than in the pack's survival. His thoughts spun, consumed by the devastating realization, the external threat had proved Torvin right. Chapter 17: The Usurpation Crown. Rylan was dragged back to a hidden, makeshift infirmary, not by his loyalists, but by two neutral pack members terrified of the sedative and the surrounding chaos. The heavy chemical had left him partially paralyzed, his shifter strength barely a flicker, his mind cloudy and detached. He could hear the distant, amplified voice echoing through the settlement, carried by the rising wind. Elder Torvin. He's making his move. Torvin had gathered the pack in the great hall, seizing the moment of weakness. Rylan tried to sit up, but his body betrayed him. Despite that internal failure, his hearing was still sharp. Torvin's voice was slick, mournful, and utterly damning. And this is the result of radical, selfish ambition. The Alpha, blinded by his desire for power, brought human corruption into our sacred circle. Torvin then leveraged the only thing he knew would work: fear. He provided a manipulated account of the battle, blaming the breach entirely on Rylan's recklessness and the human omen he had installed. The fates delivered us Maya, not as a mate, but as a warning. Torvin shouted. Not only that, but Torvin produced a fabricated document, full of false names and dates, claiming it was proof that Rylan had lied about the fated mate bond from the start. Because of that shocking evidence, the lie of his integrity was exposed, but worse, Maya's purpose was twisted. Rylan heard the sickening tide of the pack turn. The fear of being annihilated by the encroaching humans was greater than their loyalty to a compromised Alpha. The Alpha is deposed. He has endangered our women and children with his weakness and his deceit. I, Torvin, declare his Luna status null, and his Alpha status forfeit. In the quiet that followed the roaring vote, Rylan could barely breathe. She felt it, clear as day, the betrayal and confusion of the pack. His authority was gone. He had risked everything, lied, and alienated the majority, only to have his failure confirmed by the breach. I failed her. I used her, and now I've signed her death warrant. His political power was gone. That's why his immediate fear wasn't for his own life, but for Maya's. He knew Torvin would seek her out, the symbol of Rylan's corruption, and execute her immediately to secure his new rule. Chapter 18, The Lost Mate Broken Heart. The sedative was wearing off, replaced by raw, grinding pain. Rylan finally managed to shift enough to drag himself upright. The two guards Torvin had immediately posted outside the infirmary were loyalists to the elders, unmoving and armed. "Where is the human?" Rylan rasped, his voice sounding like broken glass. The younger guard, Finn, smirked. "The human? The usurper? Torvin has ordered her immediate confinement. They're dealing with impurity now." With his scent in the air, Rylan forced himself to stand, leaning heavily on the stone wall. "What confinement? Where is she?" "The old holding cells beneath the den. Torvin says she needs to be secured before the final judgment." Rylan knew the old holding cells. They were frigid, solitary, and meant for wolves awaiting execution. Which meant Maya was in immediate, fatal danger. But then, Rylan heard Finn's walkie-talkie crackle. Torvin's voice, sharp and stressed. "Report. The female is not in the cells. She has vanished. Find the human. Now." A wave of crushing despair hit Rylan. Maya hadn't been captured, she had vanished. She hadn't run to save her own life, Rylan knew. She had vanished because she was smart enough to know that if she stayed, she was dead. She didn't know what scared her more, the wolves, or the confinement, but she had chosen action. As her world tilted under the weight of Torvin's treason, Maya had run. Rylan had lost the pack. He had lost his alpha status. And now, he had lost the one person who carried the solution to their problem, the only person who had ever truly seen his plan with clear eyes. His failure was complete. That's why Rylan knew, with devastating certainty, that if he was to save his pack and redeem his integrity, he couldn't do it as the alpha. He had to do it as a renegade. After that realization, Rylan began to assess the strength of his bonds and his remaining energy, preparing to break out of his prison and hunt for his missing Luna. Chapter 19, The Human Resolve Flexed Biceps. Rylan's chest ached, not just from the sedative-laced dart, but from the crushing weight of failure. He lay hidden in a cold, dusty storeroom, his body slick with fever and sweat. She didn't know what scared her more, the pain of his wound or the image of Torvin's triumphant sneer. That night, just as utter despair threatened to swallow him, Barrick crept in. He knelt, pressing something small and damp into Rylan's hand. Not captured, Rylan. Gone. And this was left in the watchtower. She knew we'd look there. Rylan unfolded the paper, a scrawled, desperate note on a scrap of dried skin, smelling faintly of the herbs Maya used to tend her own cuts. The note was brief, urgent. It had a drawing of the mercenary camp, and then, a series of short, choppy sentences. Radios talk. They need them. Frequency. Low. Old signal jammer. The wall is a lie. Hit the supply line, not the rock. Rylan stared. As the truth unraveled, the note wasn't a desperate plea, it was a battle plan. Simple. Clinical. Devastatingly effective. Maya hadn't fled like a pawn, she had withdrawn like a general. She had overcome her internal fear and chosen to fight her captors with their own rules. In that moment, Rylan felt a staggering surge of renewed hope and fierce determination. He wasn't fighting for power anymore, he was fighting for the vision of the future contained in that scrap of hide. He was following her lead, a true act of humility and partnership. The old human radio tower, Rylan rasped, fighting the dryness in his throat. It has a frequency jammer. An antique. Torvin thinks it's cursed, that's why it's never been dismantled. She knows it can scramble the mercenaries' coordinates. Because of that insight, Rylan knew this was the turning point. His pride, his alpha strength, they had failed. But Maya's mind. It was the cure. After that realization, Rylan used the last of his strength to dictate the plan to Barrick, his voice low and strained. Find Anya. Gather all the discarded metal, anything reflective. We need to amplify that jammer signal. Tell them we are no longer fighting the elders, we are saving the pack. Chapter 20, The Gathering of Scraps Gear. Rylan watched from the shadows of the old rendering sheds as Anya and Barrick moved. They didn't recruit the main warriors, Torvin had them guarded. Instead, they gathered the misfits, the young pups, and the low-ranking wolves who had been ignored by the elders. Rylan saw them collecting discarded human materials, cracked mirrors, scraps of shiny metal from failed irrigation pumps, and even the aluminum foil Maya had once used to try to store food. Not only that, but they used their knowledge of Torvin's routines to predict when the elder would be most occupied, the evening meeting in the Great Hall. Meanwhile, Rylan directed the operation, focused and driven. He was using political intelligence instead of brute force. He knew Torvin's deep-seated contempt for technology meant he'd never guard the cursed radio tower. We need speed, not muscle, Rylan whispered to Anya when she checked on him. We must coordinate this without alerting Torvin or the external threat. We are using mirrors, Rylan. Mirrors! Anya said, shaking her head in disbelief, but her eyes held excitement. The elders would howl with disgust. This is treason of the highest, shiniest order. That's why Rylan smiled, a fierce, feral flash of teeth. Treason is the only path to survival. We are embracing the new world, Anya. We are leveraging the shame of the old. As a result of their stealth and speed, the ragtag team moved the collected scrap toward the Eastern Territory. Rylan's iron will wasn't used for tyranny, it was used for coordinated, humble defense. He was proving his leadership evolved beyond their traditional expectations. Soon after, the scrap was arrayed perfectly around the ancient, humming radio tower. Rylan, holding a small signal flare, knew the moment was now. Chapter 21, Infiltration. The air was thick with tension and the distant, rhythmic drumming of the elders' latest ritual in the Great Hall. Torvin was performing his political theater, condemning Rylan and Maya. Which meant he was distracted, the perfect time to strike. Rylan, along with Anya and two swift, young scouts, moved with unnerving silence toward the settlement perimeter. He was tense, anticipatory, his resolve a hard knot in his gut. He paused at the edge of the woods, looking back toward the glowing light of the Denver. He felt it, clear as day, he was placing himself in a strategically weak position, emphasizing his trust in Maya's plan and the courage of his small team. Rylan ignited the flare. A sharp hiss and a sudden burst of bright, smoking red light shot into the dark sky. This was the signal. The plan is in motion. The signal flare did two things. First, it alerted the wolves at the radio tower to activate the jammer. Second, it provided a visible target for the external threat. But then, Rylan heard the terrifying confirmation, the sound of rapid, heavy gunfire erupting near the wall. The external mercenaries, seeing the flare, were making a visible push toward the settlement, drawing the full attention of the usurping elders. Go, Rylan whispered to Anya, pointing toward a hidden maintenance tunnel. We enter the tunnels beneath the Great Hall. We confront Torvin at the climax of his lie. With every step he took into the dark, cold tunnels, smelling of damp earth and old rot, Rylan was accepting that his greatest fight was political, not physical. He was walking into a trap set by his weakness, armed only with the truth and the genius of his missing Luna. Chapter 22, The Climax Crown. Rylan burst through the hidden floor grate into the Great Hall, emerging like a specter from the floor itself. The smell of fear, incense, and wolf arrogance was overwhelming. Elder Torvin, standing on the dais, was midway through his condemnation. The Alpha Rylan is a disgraced traitor. His human obsession has brought sickness and war. We must purge the memory of Maya, the human omen, and restore our. The human omen just saved your lives. Rylan roared, cutting through the elder's pronouncement like a lightning strike. He was wounded, dirt-covered, but defiant, his golden eyes blazing with focused alpha fury. The pack turned, chaos seizing the hall. The air thickened. Torvin, enraged, pointed at Rylan. Treason! Seize him! But then, an unbelievable thing happened. A deafening, prolonged screech of static ripped through the settlement, the sound of every mercenary radio and communication device being completely scrambled by Maya's amplified jammer signal. Simultaneously, a massive, brilliant flash of light erupted from the eastern logging roads, followed by the terrifying, echoing sound of the mercenaries' abandoned supply truck exploding, a final, engineered diversion by Maya's loyalists. The external threat was neutralized, not by wolf teeth, but by human technology and strategy. Torvin! Rylan shouted, seizing the moment of immediate, undeniable proof. Your traditional defenses failed. Your isolation was a death sentence. The human solution, Maya's genius, repelled the attack, not your prayers. He pulled out the raven carving. You wanted to murder her and blame the breach on her. She escaped, she planned, and she saved the pack from your failure. The pack's wavering support swung back to Rylan. They looked at the fleeing dust clouds of the mercenaries outside, and then at the exposed, stammering Torvin. The proof was right there, outside the wall. He is a traitor, the neutral wolves roared. He chose power over our children. In that moment, Rylan won the political war by demonstrating that evolution is superior to tradition. Torvin's guards, seeing their cause lost, abandoned him. Chapter 23, Falling Action. The tension broke. Elder Torvin, pale and defeated, was disarmed and captured by Barrick. Rylan stood on the dais, no longer the deposed, but the reformed alpha. He was exhausted, but vindicated. He addressed the assembled pack, his voice carrying the authority of earned respect. I confess the lie, Rylan stated, his voice clear. I lied about the fated mate bond to stop murder and buy us time. That was my flaw, pragmatism turned deceitful. He paused, letting the truth settle. But then, he continued, his voice softer, the bond became real. It is a bond of partnership, foresight, and survival. I risked everything on the truth that our future requires the outside world, and Maya's mind proved me right. He pardoned those who wavered out of fear, consolidating his reformed leadership not through punishment, but through mercy. Which meant the pack would now heal, not fear. After that formal establishment of the new order, Rylan was mobbed by the healers, but all he wanted was confirmation. He found Maya in the watchtower, exactly where he had told them to look. She was pale, but whole. She had been monitoring the operation, too focused to flee. The space between them burned with shared trauma and fierce, protective love. Rylan simply walked to her, pulling her into his arms. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling her unique, beautiful scent of human cleanliness and sharp intelligence. You saved us. You saved me. You are my Luna, Maya. You earned this. Chapter 24, Falling Action. Weeks later. Elder Torvin and his key conspirators were exiled, forced to live in permanent isolation. Rylan stood with Maya in the Alpha Den, which they had completely rearranged. The ancient, dusty lore books were replaced with charts detailing drainage plans, crop rotation, and a calendar for the first controlled exchange with human traders. This is strange, Maya murmured, running a finger over a detailed map of the nearest human city. 1 month ago, this map was treason. Now it's the pack's lifeline. Rylan moved behind her, resting his chin on her shoulder. His chest ached with acceptance and profound peace. You are the human bridge, Maya. The one who taught us that survival comes through knowledge, not just power. Evolution is a choice, not a destiny. He wasn't performing the fated mate act. He was Alpha Rylan, co-leading with his partner. We start a school, Maya decided, turning slightly in his arms. For the pups. They need to learn human medicine and mathematics, not just how to hunt. We start tomorrow, Rylan agreed, kissing the top of her head. As the bond pulsed, it was no longer a political lie, but a deep, authentic connection forged in fire and truth. Epilogue scene: Evergreen Tree. Rylan stood at the newly reinforced wall. It was no longer just stone, but stone reinforced with metal mesh and hidden human sensors, a symbol of the blending of two worlds. He watched a small, nervous group of pack wolves conduct their first controlled exchange of herbs and crafts with human traders in the distance. The risk was still immense, but the threat of extinction was gone. Maya joined him, slipping her hand into his, resting her head on his shoulder. The wind carried his name, whispering it with respect now, not fear. They look healthy, Maya noted, watching the younger wolves. The latest litter, strong. 0 defects. Rylan squeezed her hand. Because the blood is no longer thin. Because we evolved together. They looked out at the vast, green world, a world of risk, of challenge, but also of health and resilience. The fight for acceptance had only just begun, but they faced it together, 2 leaders, 1 vision. And she let it happen, the love blooming between them, a final, necessary reward for their courage.